Let me speak briefly about the other two motivations. I told you my second motivation was to demystify the Reserve Bank. Why did I want to demystify the Reserve Bank? Two reasons. The first reason was that there's a lot of misconception about the Reserve Bank in the public at large. Most people think the Reserve Bank is a currency printing office. When I used to go to schools as governor, they used to recognize me as the governor, and little children would say, oh, you go to office and sign currency, that's the thing you do from morning to evening, and we don't have enough money because you're very slow in signing. Okay? Some older children will ask, so why don't you print more currency so that India can become a rich country like America? Explaining to little children that you can't become a rich country by just printing more currency is a very, very difficult, complex challenge. All of you try explaining that to your children. You will find how difficult that is, how difficult the job of the governor is. Okay? But the Reserve Bank does many things. It prints currency, of course. It's the monetary authority. What the Reserve Bank does touches people's everyday lives. The prices you pay in the market, the interest you earn on your savings bank account or on a fixed deposit, the interest you pay when you take a housing mortgage loan, how much foreign exchange you can take out if you want to send your child for education abroad, what sort of service do you get in a bank. All these things are related to what the Reserve Bank does. But people don't understand the connection between what the Reserve Bank does and their everyday lives, especially people in the hinterland of the country. So I wanted to demystify the Reserve Bank, explain to people what the Reserve Bank does and the connection between the two. There was a deeper and more important reason why I wanted to demystify the Reserve Bank, which is that there's wrong stereotypes about the Reserve Bank. The popular impression is that the Reserve Bank is rigid, unbending, stereotype views. They don't understand the reality of the country. That is not true. And I wanted to correct that impression. That impression has been going on for the last 40 years. I wrote about that in the book, but it's worth telling. My first posting in the IAS was a sub-collector Parvatipuram in Srikakulam district, a town that Srinivas referred to. I'm talking about mid-70s, mid-1970s. Srikakulam district in Andhra Pradesh was the first state, region, district in the country outside of Naxalbari to be affected by the extremist movement. By the time I went to Srikakulam, the extremist movement was on the wane. Our responsibility in the district administration at that time was to improve the livelihood of tribals, because tribals became vulnerable to extremist influence because of the subsistence living. So our theory was that if only we could improve tribal livelihood, improve their incomes, opportunities, they will grow out of the influence of the extremist movement. So my job as sub-collector was to go from one branch of one bank, like Mr. Shantanu Mukherjee will understand, go to each branch manager and canvass loans for tribals. The branch managers were understandably or sometimes not understandably wary of lending to tribals because they were not creditworthy. So they will give all sorts of reasons. And the final reason they would give, and all reasons fail to convince, is that the Reserve Bank regulations do not permit us to lend. Okay? So that's Brahmastra, right? There's no answer to that. All through my career, people used to proffer explanations about why the Reserve Bank does not allow this. It is not true that the Reserve Bank does not allow this. In fact, in the tribal area, even educated people, even some IAS officers used to say that the way to improve tribal livelihood is to disband the Reserve Bank of India. So that's an extremist view. So I wanted to demystify the Reserve Bank. That's the second motivation. Finally, the third motivation for writing about the Reserve Bank, my book, is to explain the dilemmas in public policy. In public policy, there is no black and white. it's always gray. You got to make a judgment. It's not that it's not an expense, some white or black appears and it's very clear what you have to do. Let me give you an example, because basically from here, all of you will recall the backlash against the microfinance industry here in Andhra Pradesh, in Telangana, combined state at that time, in 2010. There were many reasons for that backlash, but if you distill all that out, there were three complaints against the microfinance industry. The first was the usurious rates of interest charged by the MFIs. The second was the coercive recovery practices. And the third grievance complaint against the microfinance institutions was that they were loading the poor families with debt, one loan after another, making them indebted. So the Reserve Bank's neck was on the block. As the regulator, as the supervisor of the microfinance industry, there was understandably some lapse on the part of the Reserve Bank, because we put more premium on financial stability at that time, given the situation at that time, than on consumer protection. But anyway, to resolve the situation, I appointed a committee, the Malagam Committee. The committee made some very wise, very appropriate recommendations. The most important of those recommendations was to put a cap on the interest rate that microfinance industry can charge. Very logical, right? If the complaint against the microfinance industry is that they're charging too high an interest rate, the remedy is to cap the interest rate. Very logical, very neat on paper. In practice, it was a very difficult decision for me. Why? It was a difficult decision for me because if you throw back to 1991 or to the period before 1991, practically every interest rate in the country was regulated by the Reserve Bank. Some of you youngsters may not relate to that, but older people like me, we recall that period. Every interest rate, how much fixed the interest rate on a fixed deposit of 10 years, 7 years, savings bank account, a 15-day account, how much can be charged on farmers, on small industry, on major corporates. Every interest rate was regulated by the Reserve Bank. Gradually, over 20 years, 25 years, the Reserve Bank deregulated the interest rate structure. The last of those interest rates was on the savings bank account. On the savings bank account. In 2010, on my watch, the Reserve Bank relaxed the regulation on the savings bank account. We said the banks can charge any interest they want. Governors before me tried doing that, but the circumstances did not support that decision. On my charge, that was done. A lot of people, in fact, said that my legacy will be that more than anything else. The reason I'm saying that is that I'd done that sometime in July or whatever, 2010, and in October, the backlash against the microfinance industry, and I was called upon to regulate the interest rate. So I deregulated completely, became a historic figure, and now I was going to rewrite history by re-regulating. My fear was that whether this is the thin end of a wedge, that we start re-regulating, and again we will go by retrace our entire path of regulating the industry, interest rate structure. In any case, I put the bullet and regulated the interest rate on microfinance industry. The jury is still out, but that's what I did. The reason I'm saying that is that in public policy, there's no black and white. You got to make a judgment. So that's my book. It's about challenges I confronted as governor, demystifying the Reserve Bank, illustrating the dilemmas in making public policy. Only one comment I want to make before I leave, which is that there's been a lot of media interest in my book, but media interest was confined to a very small segment of my book about differences between the government and the Reserve Bank. It is true that I wrote about them. It is true that I wrote about them as honestly and as candidly as I wanted to. My idea in writing about that was to enhance debate in the public domain. My idea was not to play holier than thou, not to make a value judgment, not to say that the government was wrong and the Reserve Bank was right, but to say that differences between central banks and governments are common across the world in many countries. We're seeing that in Japan, we're seeing that in the US, we're seeing that in the UK, we're seeing that in Europe too. We're seeing that in India. What we lack in India is an institutional mechanism for managing those differences. Okay? So, my book is not an attempt to defend my record, but to explain the challenges and dilemmas. My book is not an attempt to rewrite the narrative, but to explain the issues, the circumstances which shaped that narrative in the first place. My intent was to communicate the challenges of making public policy during very turbulent times. Thank you very much.